Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm going to play with the Timeless Butterflies collection. This is new from Spellbinders. They sent me a few packages to create with and share with you. These are beautiful embellishment that come in different color themes. That first package color is called Summer Day. The second one is called Twilight. And then the third one is called Sunrise. I'm going to do a couple cards from each package. And the first one I'm starting with is the Summer Day butterflies. I'm going to combine them with some different new releases that we've had in the last few months, just to show that they can be used in so many different ways. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm embossing some cardstock with the Luxe Backdrop and Border 3D embossing folder. This one creates a beautiful floral border, and I thought it would be perfect to go with these butterflies. Now the cool thing about these butterflies is the back part of the embellishment is a full sticker, and then the top part is an acrylic part that is flexible, and it pops right up. So you can flatten it easily to mail, but then it pops right up as soon as you take it out of the envelope. So it's got some natural dimension to it that you don't even have to work for. I have a few other embossing folders here that I want to use for future cards within this video. So I'm just embossing them all at the same time, and I'm going to let them dry. When I emboss with 3D embossing folders, I like to mist this cardstock on both sides with a light mist of water, and it just loosens up those paper fibers. And because of that, and because the paper is damp, I usually let it sit aside to dry completely before I start working with it. For this first card, I'm using one of the sentiments from the new Always You Timeless Sentiments press plate set. This is one that I used in the last video I did, and it's from the newest Timeless collection from Spellbinders. And I love the variety of sentiments in here. I'm going to press it directly onto the card base, and I'm just using some black distress ink. You could use black Better Press ink here as well. I just grabbed the first black pad that I could find. If, like me, you get a little bit on that base, best to wipe it off before doing your pressing so that you don't happen to get any onto your card base. Now, because I'm using a card base here and it's two thicknesses of cardstock, it's going to press right in there. So I do get a little bit heavier pressing than if it was just one sheet of Better Press cardstock, but it's still pressed absolutely perfectly. For my 3D embossed border here, I just chose a few different distress inks that I thought coordinated well with the butterflies in that Summer Day Butterflies package. So I have some scattered straw here that I'm using on a few of the blooms, and I'm trying to be very light-handed with my ink blending brush. You could also use a detailed ink blending brush here because those a lot of those flowers are so tiny. The next pad that I grabbed was Worn Lipstick, but it had too much of a corally look to it compared to the butterflies in the package, so I went and grabbed some Kitsch Flamingo. And again, I'm trying to be very, very light-handed here. I went and grabbed a detailed brush for this because some of the flowers that I wanted to do were really tiny, as well as the fact that I wanted to do some of the flower centers of the yellow flowers. Now, what I'm trying to do is be light-handed with my inks. I want to coordinate with the colors in the butterflies, but I'm trying not to overpower them. For this embossing, I left my background white, but I think this would be absolutely gorgeous done with a black background and then the inking. And I do that technique in a later card so you can see that done and see exactly what I'm talking about. And it just requires inking your embossing folder and pressing that ink into your paper, and then you get a black background or whatever color you want. I do a few different techniques in this video, but I think these colors would really pop in there. So you'll see that later on, but I wanted to keep this light florally. I wanted to keep it a white background for this particular one because I wanted you to be able to see the different colors on the different colored backgrounds. Once you have all that ink in place, I'm going to glue that right onto my card base. Now, I've used this embossing folder before. I have a video where I use the backdrop part of the embossing folder in many different ways, and I will link to that at the end of this video. I did another one where I just used this floral part of the embossing folder and did the edge of a card. So there are different ways to use this embossing folder, and I love that it's so versatile and that you have a choice of both the backdrop as well as the border with it. It gives you so many more creative options. To finish off the florals in this card, I'm just using some stickles. I like to put little dots of them. It takes less time to dry if it's little dots, as well as the fact that I personally think with stickles, less is more. I like a touch of it for the sparkle, but I don't like it to be overpowering. So I'm going to peel off the butterfly from this package and add it to the card. And I love that the butterflies are on some clear acetate or acrylic or whatever that is, plastic, so that you can see through them to see which one you like on the background of your card. And you'll see me doing that several times through this video to try choose which butterfly I like best for the card design that I was doing. For the second card that I'm doing with the Summer Day butterflies, I'm using the Cosmos Backdrop press plate. I've used this one also in a few different videos. So if you want to see different ways of using some of the supplies that I'm using today, look back at my past few videos or past videos for the last few months, and you'll see a bunch of different ways. I always love trying to use my products in as many different ways as I think. Not every single way, but I like to try to get creative with it. I always find that if you know many different ways to use a product, that it becomes more valuable. I'm going to use the coordinating stencil with this in order to color it, and I'm just going to do some ink blending in order to fill in the areas of the stencil. I'm using those same colors that I used for the first card. I'm using the Scattered Straw, as well as that Kitsch Flamingo, and then I'm adding a little bit of Bundled Sage for the floral greenery. When I'm ink blending through a stencil, I will put my brush, I will do it clockwise as well as counterclockwise, just to make sure that full stencil gets all of the ink. I did Scattered Straw for the whole area of the floral petals, and then I'm using the Kitsch Flamingo, and I'm just trying to concentrate it to the center of the flower so that we have some pink in the center, or because the pink and the yellow are a little bit transparent, they kind of turn into a bit of a coral color, and then it goes to yellow on the outside of the flower. So these stencils here, they match perfectly. There's 5 different stencils in the set, and you can see at the bottom left of each stencil, they have a number on there, so you know what number order, but you really don't have to stick with that order. The third stencil is the centers of the flowers, and I want to do something a little bit different for that. So I'm going to be doing the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth, and then I will go back to the third one. So it's not going to change anything if you go out of order. You're going to end up with the exact same result. So I'm using Distress inks to ink blend in these stencils. You can use whatever inks you want. I like the Distress inks simply because they are transparent. I'm using a very light hand with them because, once again, I want to coordinate and complement the butterflies, but I'm not trying to overpower them. I'm just trying to create a floral background for them to go on. So now I'm on the 4th stencil here, and I'm just using that Bundled Sage. The 4th and the 5th stencil are all greenery, so I'm going to use the same color for both of them. If you wanted to add a little bit of shading, you could add another color or another ink pad. I'm just trying to be as light-handed as possible, but then being a little bit heavier-handed where I wanted it to be a little bit shaded. So it's easy enough to do that with one ink pad. I have my paper taped down, and I also tape my stencil down. That way I can make sure that it doesn't shift while I'm doing my ink blending. I can concentrate on that ink blending and not making sure that that stencil is exactly where I want it to be. So once I have my floral petals as well as my leaves done, the last stencil is the centers of those flowers. I'm going to use some Hickory Smoke Distress ink just to add a little bit of gray in the center. And then I'm going to add some Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel. This comes in a pot, and it's basically like a texture paste, but it's glitter gel. It's stickles, and it's got some really cool iridescent and silvery glitter amongst it. And I love using these with layering stencils because it's a great way to add some sparkle and some shine and a little bit of dimension in some areas. By doing that Hickory Smoke Distress ink first, it's going to add a little bit of color. This glitter gel is just has no color to it other than the glitter, but I wanted there to be a touch of color in there. So what I try to do is only take the amount that I need for what I'm doing in that center, so then I'm not putting my palette knife in the pot more than once. Sometimes when you're using inks with them, that ink will lift up with the gel. So I like to try to do it one time. Sometimes I'll have to grab a little bit more, and this time I did, but I try not to transfer any of that ink over. In order to add a bit of a faux matte, I just use my chisel end of my Copic marker. This is something that I've done many times. You could also use some black cardstock behind it. I just didn't want to trim my piece down too much, and by doing a faux matte, it's a lot quicker, as well as the fact that I can get a nice, even, thin line all the way around it. I have a sentiment here that is from a previous foiling session that I'm going to be using, and it's got some holographic silver to it, which is perfect for the sparkly edges of these stickers. I'll be doing a little bit of foiling later on in this video, so I didn't want to do it here. I'm using some previous sentiments that I've had done from before. This sentiment is from the You Are Everything Sentiments collection, and like I said, it coordinates beautifully with the butterflies. For my third card, I'm moving on to the Twilight butterflies. So my color palette is changing in order to coordinate with that. And I'm using the new Timeless 5x7 card fronts die set. My last video was using this die set in many different ways. So this time I'm just taking that die set and I'm just going to emboss the die detail into the cardstock. So the first thing I'm doing is taking another one of those Always You Timeless sentiments, and I pressed it onto some Purple Mist cardstock from Spellbinders. This is a little scrap that's left over from die cutting the outline die from the 5x7 card fronts as well as the oval die. I die cut those outlines and that oval off screen, but I'm going to do the embossing on screen here. So I'm placing my dies that I want to do the embossing and I'm taping them in place to make sure that they're not going to move. Now, when I'm placing my tape, I am aware of what parts are going to be covered and what parts are not. And the reason I am aware of this is because sometimes when you have die tape and you're doing some embossing, you get the impression of that tape. So I want to make sure that I do those on areas where they are covered. So I'm using my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine here, and I'm using the stacking for embossing a die, and it's right on the plates. So Spellbinders makes it really, really easy to know which layering you need for different things, as well as what plates or the rubber embossing mat that you're going to need. So you can see that you get some gorgeous detail by just embossing that. And it's just a different way to use your dies and give them some more use. That rubber embossing mat there helps to press all of that in. Now I'm just embossing the dies. You could also ink your dies and then emboss them. The only thing is you'd have to be really, really careful when you're placing them, because if you place them and then move them, you're going to have an ink smear. So what I like to do instead is just emboss my dies plain, and then I like to do a little bit of ink blending on them. You could leave them completely plain and not do any ink blending, but I love the look of it with the ink blending as well. I have some more distress pads here. This one is Prize Ribbon, and I have a large ink blending tool that I just got, and it's great for doing larger areas. It's really, really easy to hold in the hand and really easy to put down a whole lot of ink at one time. If you don't have a large ink blending tool, you can use a smaller one. It just takes a little bit longer. Now what I'm trying to do is get my ink a lot darker around the edges and then lighter towards the center. And I'm going to go after this prize ribbon. I'm going to do some black around the edges as well, just to deepen that even more. If you wanted to see more of that lilac cardstock or that purple cardstock underneath, you could be really light-handed with your inking and make sure that those recessed areas don't get any ink on them. But I was making sure to get a lot of ink around the edges. So you have an option with different ways to get your ink on there to get different looks. I wanted to be able to see that texture, but I also wanted to be able to see those ink colors and have them complement each other. So now I'm taking a smaller ink blending tool and I'm just going around the edges with that black. I'm being light-handed with this. I want it to stick around those edges. I'm not going inside the area at all. I don't want to cover up a lot of that blue. I just want to get a touch of black in there. These butterflies have some black detail on them, so I wanted to complement that by getting a little bit of that black in there and tying that all in. So I chose my colors depending on the colors in the butterfly package I was using. Obviously, if you use different packages or different embellishments, you can change up your colors. And I love the fact that by having cardstock and using ink blending with them, you can easily alter and change and enhance whatever it is that you're wanting to do and get the look that you want. So I have a 5x7 card base here, and I thought that white was a little bit too stark behind those ink blended die cuts. So I'm just taking a little bit of Villainous Potion. It goes well with the butterflies as well as the colors that are already ink blended on the other pieces, and I'm just going around the edges. The outline, the large outline die cut that's embossed is going to cover a large area of it, so I just want to go around the outside of it. And as I'm doing this, I'm trying to make sure not to get my card base in the ink on my desk, so I'm trying to move it over so that it is in clean areas. And I regularly am cleaning the ink off of this surface so that I'm not getting it on my card bases. You can see that this mat does start to mar and stain and get a little bit grungy over time. It still works the exact same, it just doesn't look nearly as pretty. So with all of my pieces ink blended, I can start gluing everything down. I like to use some Barely Art glue in a fine tip bottle. It makes it really easy for large die cuts as well as small die cuts. I can use that same glue and that same bottle with both and just adjust how much glue I'm using for each one. I also love to use an acrylic block to hold everything down in place. It makes sure that everything has good contact for that glue to start sticking and drying, and then frees my hands up for my next, or to put glue on my next piece or to work on my next piece. So now that those die cuts are in place, I was at one point going to use just one of these butterflies, but I kind of thought 3 of the smaller ones would be nice. That way I could get some of the different colors in there and just add a little bit more interest to it. So once again, just peeling them off of the back of that plastic and then gluing them right onto the card. And they glue down really nicely, even though there's a lot of texture there from embossing that die. So for my 4th card, I want to use one of those backgrounds that I embossed. It is all dry now from being misted when I first embossed it, but I want to do another technique with the background. So I am going to put that back in my embossing folder. I can just move it around and it locks into place when I get to the area where it was first embossed. While I'm taping this down, I'm making sure that tape is only on like the outer 1/8 of an edge. I don't want to go in too much because obviously as I'm inking this background, ink is not going to go behind that tape. So I want to have as little covered as possible. When I cut this down to go onto the front of my card, I want to be able to control how much I cut down. So by having tape covering the least amount possible, I can do that. So I first went with that prize ribbon and I went over the background of my embossing folder. When you have an embossing folder, there is one side that has all that detailed puffed up, and then there's one side that has all that detailed recessed. So I am working on the side that has all of the detail recessed, so I'm only adding ink to that background. So I started with that prize ribbon, then I'm going to clean off that excess ink off my embossing folder. I have a wet cloth as well as a dry cloth, and then I'm using some Villainous Potion, and I'm only going to go up about 2/3 of the way. So I close my embossing folder and just kind of pay attention to where 2/3 of the way up is, and then I have my ink blending tool. I'm just buffering or making that line not as stark. I'm blending it out a little bit because I want that background to have a bit of an ombre look. So I'm doing a couple of passes with each ink color to make sure that that ink color completely covers the area that I want. And when I'm blending it with that ink blending brush, I'm being very light-handed. I'm trying not to get the ink into the recessed areas. Some of it's going to go there anyways because of the way the embossing folder is designed. Some of it is not nearly as recessed as others. So I am getting some of that detail with that ink, but that's okay. I'm just trying to get most of it on the background, and I'm trying to really enhance the details from the raised parts. So I'm going to do that same thing with the black, except for the black, I'm only going about 1/3 of the way up. Once again, I am using my ink blending brush and I'm using it I'm tapping it just to blend out those lines so they're not stark and harsh. And again, you can go through this as many times as you want. You do still want to make sure that the initial embossing is dry, because if it's still damp when you're doing that, your inks are going to bleed just a touch. When I mist them to do that embossing, it's not sopping wet, it's just damp, but it's enough that I think the inks would not leave crisp lines. So you do want to make sure that initial embossing has been completely dried before you do this inking step. And I'm using 3 different distress colors here. You can use many different types of ink for this. Distress works well for this, and it also cleans off the embossing folder really, really easily. So it is one of my favorite ways to do it because I get a really nice impact and effect, but it cleans off very easily. Just rinses off right under the tap. I chose a black mat to go behind it, and I just have a really fine black mat. And I also have one more of those sentiments from the You Are Everything sentiment set that was previously done in another video. It is on black cardstock. I used Versamark ink and I embossed it with silver. And then I did the coordinating die to die cut everything. Once I have that glued on, and I used a Simon Says stamp ruler in order to make sure that that was straight all the way across. I picked the butterfly that I wanted to use, and I added it to one of the embossed butterflies from the embossing folder. I made it so that that butterfly was a little bit smaller so that you could see the white outline of the wings behind it. I thought it would pop a little bit more by doing that. And then I took some twinkle stickles and just added dots of it to some of the dots of the butterfly, as well as the dots from the center of the flowers. It's just going to add a touch of sparkle and a touch of dimension, or just a little bit of a different texture to that background. And then I let it completely dry, and here is the finished card. I love that ombre background as well as the texture you get from it. So the last butterfly package I'm going to use is this Sunrise Butterflies. I'm actually going to do 3 cards with this. I was trying to do 2 per package, and I just had too many ideas. So that's not a bad thing. So this first one here is where I'm doing that black background that I was talking about way at the beginning. So if you wanted to change up that first card and have the back of the embossing black, this is the technique that you would use for that. So once again, I'm taping that back into my embossing folder. This is completely dried, and it's really easy to just move it around that embossing folder, figure out where it was the first time and match that up. It locks into place. You do still want to tape it down, because when you do this and when you do it multiple times, you want to make sure that you can just pay attention to that ink and not have to worry about that paper moving around. Again, exactly the same as the last card. There are 2 sides of that embossing folder, one where the details are raised and one where they're depressed. I have my paper taped down to the side where those details are raised, and I'm putting my ink on the side where the details are recessed so that that ink is only going on the background. And again, you can do this as many times as you want to make sure that you have as much ink coverage as you want. I find that the first time you don't get nearly as much, like it doesn't cover it completely. So by doing it more than once, often 2 times is enough. This particular one, I realized after that first pressing that I actually didn't have my ink going down far enough. So there was an area that was missed. So I ended up doing it 3 times. And this is one of those folders that just this way on its own looks absolutely stunning. I think it makes a stunning background. But then you can take an ink pad and you can ink it to add some color to those flowers. And I'm just being very light-handed. I'm only trying to get that ink on the uppermost raised surfaces. I'm not trying to cover all of that white. I just want a touch of that color to coordinate with those butterflies, and I'm not worried about having everything completely inked. So this color here is Saltwater Taffy, and then I'm going to use some weathered wood to do my greenery. Now the weathered wood is blue, and that's totally fine. I chose it because it coordinates well with those butterflies. And as I'm inking here, I actually really love the greenery done with a blue. It's unexpected, and it's obviously not traditional and not true to nature, but I think it looks really, really cool. So once again, I'm just being very light-handed. I'm trying to get a little bit more ink at the base of the stem where I naturally do a little bit of extra shading, but I'm not trying to cover all of the white. I just want a hint of that color. That hint of color is just going to coordinate beautifully with the butterflies from the Sunrise Butterflies package, and it's just going to tie them in great. So with that completely done, I can trim that embossed panel down. And typically when I trim these panels down, I'll do maybe 1/8 of an inch off of each side, just because I don't want to lose a lot of that dimension and that detail. I love what that embossed image gives. So by just trimming a tiny little bit down, I can take off those areas where I had the tape, but not lose a whole lot from my embossed background. So once again, I use one of those foiled backgrounds. This is from the You Are Everything Sentiments. This is a Better Press plate collection, but you can foil them really, really easily and they turn out beautiful. And I love how that prism holographic foil coordinates beautifully with the holographic foil on the outside of those butterflies. For the next card with this particular set, I pulled out my glimmer machine. I have some indigo cardstock from Spellbinders, and I have some holographic facets silver glimmer foil. This coordinates beautifully with the holographic foil that's around the outside of those butterflies, and that's why I chose it. And I'm using it with the Mirrored Arch Nested Sprigs press plate set. So I have my plates on there. I have my foil with the pretty side facing the plate, and then my cardstock on top. Press that timer button, and once it's done, I put it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. Now this press plate set has a sentiment with it that I'm using, and typically you would have it centered in the center of your image. I have it lower, centered between the sides, but lower because I want to put one of the butterflies above it in the center of my card. Now I always love to do solid hot foiling when I'm doing my foiling. I sometimes use them on my cards, and sometimes I save it for a future project. I just would rather have cardstock with that foil on it to store rather than a piece of foil to do that negative hot foiling. Today I'm going to be using it on my card. I have my indigo piece here that I'm just cutting down. I'm trying to trim as much of that indigo off, but not cut into my foiled sprigs. So I will do this a couple times around so that I get kind of an even message or measurement. And then I also cut my holographic because there was an area that had a little bit of white on it. So I cut that down as well. I'm using the Mirrored Arch Labels die, and I'm cutting some different layers to go onto the front of my card. I want to have some layers to give it some extra dimension. And I'm also paying attention when I'm putting that tape down to cut my layers. I'm making sure that my tape is going where another layer is going to cover it. When you put this tape on top of foil and you lift this tape up, often the foil will have a different finish on it. You lift a little bit of it off and you get a bit of a different finish on it. So just be aware of that when you're doing your die cutting and doing your taping down. Pay attention where your tape is going so that you don't accidentally mess up a little bit of foil that you're going to have visible on the front of your card. I have a little piece of peach sorbet cardstock here that I'm doing another layer, and I'm going to insert that between some of the other layers just to coordinate that little coral color there. I have a saltwater taffy oxide pad here, and I'm using a disposable, I think it's an eyeliner brush. I'll have them linked with all the other supplies that I'm using in the description below. I'm just adding a little bit of that saltwater taffy color to my indigo cardstock, just going inside some of those flowers to tie it all in and to coordinate it. I only put this saltwater taffy on there. I didn't do all of the leaves. Because there are pigment properties in this oxide ink, if you do it over the foil, it's going to affect it a little bit. Because I'm only doing it on some small flowers, it doesn't affect it enough for it to be noticeable, but I didn't want to completely cover or color in the entire area. The greenery I don't think is noticed, but I did think it would be a nice complement to have the coral color on those flowers. And if by chance you get a little bit too much of that ink on top of your foil, you can easily take a soft cloth and wipe it off to make that foil shine again. But just be aware that it does affect it a little bit. Now that I have all my pieces done, I can glue everything in place. And you can see how I have layers here that have pieces cut out from the different layers. Because something is going on top of it, you're never going to know. And you might as well utilize those pieces as much as possible. It's nice to have that holographic outline as well as the outline on some of my inner layers. So you'll never know that underneath it was the center of that holographic that was cut out in order to create that layer, as well as the center of the indigo cardstock to create that layer. It's just a great way to stretch your cardstock out, especially specialty cardstocks. They're not cheap, and by being able to stretch our supplies a little bit like this, it just makes them go a little bit further. So now I can pick which butterfly I want to go on this card. And once again, it's nice to have that clear background in order to make it really easy to pick and choose which one works best. And then I can glue that onto the front of the card. And I love all the holographic sparkle that ties in with the outline of that butterfly. So now I'm on my last card here. I have the Peony Celebration die set, and I'm going to cut one out of the indigo cardstock, and then I'm going to cut one out of that peach sorbet cardstock. With the peach sorbet, I have some press and seal that I'm putting on the back of it before taking it out of my die set For the indigo one, I just took it out of my die set and tossed these centerpieces because I didn't think I would be using them for anything. But for these peach ones, I want to use just those inner pieces, but I want to have them all together so I can do a little bit of ink blending on them, get a little bit of shading, and by having it on that press and seal, it keeps everything in place. So when I start to glue everything together, it's the easiest puzzle ever to glue together. I have a detailed ink blending brush here that I'm using to add that ink on it, and I'm trying to put the ink on the inside part of the petals and then flicking that brush on the way out just to get a little bit of shading. I don't want to completely cover the die cut piece. If I was going to cover that die cut piece, I would just use a darker piece of that cardstock. By doing this, I just get some natural dimension to it. It just looks a little bit more interesting in my opinion. This die set also has an outline die, and I've die cut that in white cardstock so that it has a nice white outer edge. Putting the Barely Art glue on the back of it, and you can see how easy it is to use this fine line glue bottle with a die cut like this. You can get exactly how much glue you need on the back of this. Once I have this outline die glued to the shadow, I can start gluing in my petal pieces, and I like to work about 5 petals at a time. I'll put the glue down and then I just pick off those pieces right off of that press and seal background and put it into the outline area on my piece here. And you can see how it's really easy to know exactly what piece goes where. It, like I said, easiest puzzle ever to pull it from one and put it into another. And it comes together really, really quickly and easily like this. If you were to take all of these pieces outside of the die and then ink blend them all separately and then try to figure out exactly where each piece goes, it would take a lot longer and would be much less enjoyable. So I love doing it this way, and I love the fact that you have that little bit of extra shading on the peach color. It just gives it a little bit more interest and a little bit more dimension. Now, because I'm inserting these pieces right into the blue outline, it pretty much has a flat feel to it. If you wanted some extra dimension to it, you could add another of the indigo outline on top of it to make that raised. Or you could have glued that entire blue piece down and then put these peach pieces on top of it so that those pieces were raised. I personally like the look of it this way, but those are also options if you wanted to add a little bit of extra dimension to it. You can see how quickly and easily this comes together. And while indigo cardstock is definitely not a traditional choice for the outline and the greenery, I love the look it gives. Another option if you wanted is you could also cut this out of, or do another die cut out of some green and then cut those blooms off and have that green for the greenery, but I really love the indigo color for the greenery. The other thing that I wanted to mention, when I die cut that peony out of that indigo cardstock, I had a piece of cardstock that was 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I cut it out of that center, and that way I can use that as a mat around my image piece as well. When I go to use it, I am going to cut it down so it'll end up being 4 inches by 5 1/4, and then this embossed piece is going to be 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So I'll have a 1/4 inch between each of the different sizes. Just a way to frame everything in. So I'm using my large ink blending tools here, and I'm ink blending some weathered wood as well as some faded jeans. So I did the weathered wood about 2/3 of the way up, and then I'm doing the faded jeans with that same ink blending brush just about 1/3 of the way up. Again, a little bit of an ombre look. It just coordinates well with those butterflies as well as gives a interesting background for my peony to sit on. So I can use this cardstock here as my mat, just putting that glue on the backside, and you'll never know, other than this video evidence, that there's a piece cut out of that cardstock. Might as well get double duty out of it and stretch our supplies a little bit more. So when I glue down 3D embossed images, I make sure that I have a lot of glue on there. And I also especially make sure to have glue on the areas that are going to be sticking to the piece below. So you want to make sure that when you are gluing them down, you have enough glue for that texture basically. You'd want to make sure that you have some on the areas that are going to stick to that cardstock below it. Once that has sat for a few moments and let that glue start to stick, I can glue down my peony image. Once again, using that same glue. You can put it however you want on the front of your card. And I love the look of that textured background with that colored die cut. I can pick and choose which butterfly I want here and add that to it. I didn't choose to put a sentiment on here. You could put one on the inside of the card, or you could add one if you wanted, but I love the look of it without it, so I left it without. So here are all of the cards that we've created in this video. I love the different color combinations that these packages or these butterflies come in. And this was only 3 different color combinations. There's a whole bunch more as well. So there are other ones to suit your color choices if these aren't your cup of tea. But you can see that there's so many different ways that you can use them. They coordinate well with many, many different techniques. And they're a great way to add some dimension and texture to your cards. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you spending the time with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.